It is known as Maskirovka, an age-old Russian military strategy describing tactics that deceive, disguise, surprise, and deny. It's a strategy that many see playing out today in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, a conflict in which Russia denies direct involvement. Joining us for more on the history of Maskirovka and its uses, in Washington, D.C., Angela Stent, director at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. She's also author of The Limits of Partnership, U.S.-Russian Relations in the 21st Century. And in Fredericton, New Brunswick, via Skype, Mikhail Molchanov, professor of political science at St. Thomas University, and it's good to have you two familiar faces back on our program again. Let's start, Mikhail, if you would, with a basic definition of Maskirovka. How would you define it?
Well, literally, this is disguise or art of disguise. It can be also translated as camouflage. Well, I've seen other translations which are more eccentric, but basically the typical one is military deception tactics and military camouflage tactics.
How far back does this term go?
I believe it goes back to the 19th century. I'm not a linguist, I can't tell for sure, but apparently this is a borrowed word from French or English. So from masking, and it was used extensively already by the turn of the 20th century by both the Imperial Russian Army and the Red Army. In fact, I looked at several military textbooks which are available online and dating back to 1920s, and I already found the usage of the term there.
Angela Stent, I don't want to get I don't want to stereotype people here. However, some people claim that Russians really are the master of this technique, and I wonder whether you feel deceptiveness or Maskirovka is built into the Russian culture.
Well, first of all, let me say the Russians aren't the only country and people that use this. I mean, let's go back to the Trojan horse. Even maybe before. So throughout the centuries, different countries have used these deceptive techniques to outfox their enemies. It's quite normal. And I would say even today, in most of the militaries and certainly in most of the intelligence services in the world, there are people who work directly on the idea of deception, denial, and things like that. So this is not a uniquely Russian tactic. But I think what we've obviously seen recently, and particularly in the war in Ukraine with the little green men and the Russian government continually denying that they have anything to do with it. We've seen this art in the 21st century, in the 20th century as well, taken maybe to perfection in a way that other countries do not seem to be as talented in doing it. And I think it's then accompanied by a range of other things in society. We know there's an information war going on in Russia where the Russian people are given one version of what's happening, for instance, in Ukraine, which doesn't accord with our version of it. So it's a military issue. But it's also kind of more a general societal issue. And I think this, if you put all those things together, it seems that as if now the Russians really are the masters at doing this.
Okay, Mikhail, would you care to either sign on to or disagree with the notion that the Russians are the masters of this?
Well, I guess it's a pleasing assertion for Russian military command, but I would totally agree with Professor Stent that this is not unique to Russia. In fact, she mentioned Trojan horse. There is also, of course, a famous example of a military classic by Sun Tzu, Art of War, the 6th century before Christ, where he says, and I quote, "All warfare is based on deception." So all militaries more or less using this since time immemorial. In fact, the First and the Second Gulf War were also featuring these operations, which could be described as deception and disguise. You can also argue that the British military, Chinese, North Korean, basically any big military in the world is doing that. And well, given this laurel of masters to the Russian army, perhaps maybe seductive for the Russian military command. They're getting some decorations for that. But I would be a little bit more skeptical about that. In fact, I recall when I was studying military tactics as a student at Kiev State University, back in the 80s, we had this mandatory military training even for philosophers. I've never heard of Maskirovka. I heard about infiltration as a tactics. Yes, there was one class about that, but there was no special class devoted to disguise and deception tactics. So I think actually Russian leadership in this regard may be a little bit exaggerated.
Okay, Angela Stent, if we do look at the scope of history, and we're certainly focused on Russia, Crimea, Ukraine today, Trojan horse of many, many years ago, do you have other examples somewhere in the middle that might be equally as familiar to our viewers of Maskirovka in action?
Well, I'm not a military historian. I can think of perhaps Israel during the Six-Day War, when they did things at night. They used the same equipment, but by doing it at night, their enemies, their antagonists, didn't realize it was there. So I'm sure there are many examples of this. But as I say, I look upon what's happening today. It's a military issue, clearly, in Ukraine and in Crimea, but it's also part of a more general development that's happening in Russian society, in the way that the leadership and the country is structured. And some of that goes back, obviously, for centuries. They're elements of the political culture. If you look at the political system, where there has always been deliberate camouflaging of what's really happening at the top, and there's a real opacity there. But as I say, that's a more general trait in Russian history, not specifically just a military one.
Sure. Let's also welcome to our discussion now in Providence, Rhode Island, Tom Nichols. He's professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. And Professor Nichols, I wonder, as we're discussing Maskirovka here, could you, I guess the allegation is that the Russians have really got this cornered. They've got the world, they've got it all figured out in terms of this style of battle today. But are there other countries around the world that you think do it also, and maybe even as well?
Well, Maskirovka simply refers to strategic deception. There are examples throughout history when the United States and its allies deceived the Nazis into thinking that we were going to land at Calais instead of Normandy, for example. But I don't think the Russians have cornered the market on this, and I think that it's even misleading to talk about Maskirovka in a place like Ukraine right now, because frankly, the Russians really aren't making that much of an effort to hide what they're doing. They put in the little green men who don't wear Russian uniforms. They deny that they're Russians. And then we say, well, there are Russian forces in Ukraine. And they say, OK, so there are. It's almost like they don't even bother to deny it. So it's not like they're working very hard at Maskirovka in the traditional sense of a grand strategic deception. They're simply not. They don't have to, for one thing.
Well, we've got a couple of pictures here that we want to put up just to amplify on what you've just said. Let's do that, control room, if we can. Two photos showing what many people say is Maskirovka in action, its most basic form. There's people wearing the masks, some of the so-called little green men without the insignia of Crimea. These are men believed to be Russian servicemen marching outside a Ukrainian military base near the Crimean city of Simferopol. And then if we go to the next picture after that, we've got a pro-Russian separatist guard at a checkpoint in Slavyansk. And once again, you've got just a green military uniform, no insignias, a mask on the face, no way to identify who that is. Mikhail Molchanov, do you think this is this a good example of Maskirovka in your view?
Actually, the first one is a poor example, precisely as I said. If you have a special operatives trying to infiltrate and to perform some military task, you would think that they would be wearing civilian clothes and not military uniform, and be so easily detected by the clearly uniform from the stocks of the Russian military. Well, as for Ukraine, the problem, of course, is that, and Russians continue to deny that there are any special regular forces there in Ukraine, that all of these people are volunteers. And the problem on the Ukrainian side is, well, if we are not willing to give Russians benefit of a doubt, we need to present the serious evidence that indeed there is a command and control involved, that there is a planned operation from the very top, that indeed there are units of Russian military which act as combat units which are being transplanted from the regular service into the eastern Ukraine. And honestly, I don't think this is the case. What we see and what we hear even from oppositional press, from intelligence by NATO, we hear about the camps which train those volunteers. We hear about various people from various parts of the country being gathered near Rostov-Don and then assembled as a unit. So in fact, I agree with my colleagues. Russians do not try to disguise their actions too much because there is nothing to disguise. There is no regular military involvement in a sense of a combat operation which is being commanded and controlled from the central headquarters.
Tom Nichols, could I get your view on that?
Sure. I think it's important not to confuse Maskirovka with just plain thuggery. Putting a mask on someone and stripping the insignia off their uniform is not exactly a sophisticated strategic deception. It's more just of outright gang behavior. Maskirovka, in the larger sense, is something that reflects cleverness, deceptiveness, military cunning, sleight of hand. This is just putting masks on guys with guns who are then intimidating other people into giving up their territory. So I think we have to be careful not to try to apply too much meaning to that word when really the word we're just looking for is thuggishness.
Okay, here's how Ben McIntyre in the Times a couple of months ago described it. He says Maskirovka is one of the defining features of Vladimir Putin's Russia. The annexation of Crimea and Moscow's war by proxy in Ukraine are classic examples of Russian military subterfuge, invasions by stealth, deliberately shrouded in deniability and confusion. But Maskirovka is more than just a military concept. It has become state policy, a deliberate blurring of truth and illusion that is the key to Putin's hold on power. I'd like to get all of you to react to that, but as I do so, let me just add that NATO's Major General Skip Davis also says Maskirovka, quote, probably started out as military doctrine, but now is much more a part of state policy. Angela Stent, do you believe that to be the case as well?
Well, again, I'll go back to what I said before, and that is, you know, for centuries, Russia has been ruled by a small group of people. It's always been ruled in an opaque way. It hasn't been transparent. You've either really had a strong leader or you've had elites around a leader that's a nominal leader, and everyone pretends they're strong, but they're not really. So this is an old Russian tradition. This goes back for centuries. This is, again, not something new. It's never had a transparent a political system. I think what's different now under Vladimir Putin, and particularly since the war in Ukraine began, is this very sophisticated use of social media, which of course didn't exist before, to, if you like, exacerbate the muddled story and to sort of basically say there's no such thing as facts. My facts are just as valid as your facts.
Professor Molchanov, state policy, a deliberate blurring of truth and illusion. Do you think Russia is practicing that right now in Ukraine?
Well, I think, again, I would back probably what Professor Stent had to say, that we are mixing terms here. We are talking about the absence of transparency and accountability in the government, which is the standing feature of Russian politics for some time. And we are talking about military operational use of disguise tactics, which is something being practiced by all nations, all countries. In fact, you mentioned Major General Gordon Davis. I just recently looked at his interview where he says, and I quote, "We had gotten to the point where we were briefing almost daily and watching what was happening between the Maidan protesters and Viktor Yanukovych government." So if you make this statement, put it against the background of the United States claiming that it maintains completely disinterested, neutral stance towards Ukraine, that the only thing we're interested is democracy promotion. And here is the statement from a military commander that says they were briefed daily, that they were looking into what's going on. Putting this against the facts of the Department of State involvement in the Maidan protest, you can say that the disguise or Maskirovka tactics was used by the American officials as much as by Russians ones.
I should let Professor Nichols respond to the notion that America does it too.
I think it's a little unfair to say that the Americans operate this way. The Americans tend to simply show up in force. That's the American way of war, is to show up in uniform and with a pretty big hammer. But if you go back to the early Cold War, when we were intervening in elections in foreign countries or trying to destabilize regimes that were unfavorable to the United States in the 1940s and 50s, sure, there were actions like that were taken by the United States and its allies, and we didn't need a special word for them. They had a whole set of terms that were perfectly serviceable. Again, covert action, destabilization, espionage, assassination, violence, all of these things that are simply part and parcel of the Russian tools of statecraft and have been for a long time.
I would really like to come back to the point that I think was made, somehow equating what the U.S. and Russia are doing in Ukraine. And I can't agree with that. I mean, the Assistant Secretary of State went on the Maidan. That's not covert action. You can agree or disagree with what she did. But what the U.S. has done since the crisis began has pretty much been completely open. And, you know, if you want to get a version of facts and what's happening in Ukraine, you have access to lots of different sources in the United States. And so I really think that to compare now in what's happening in Ukraine, what the U.S. is doing with what the Russians are doing, you know, I really don't think that's an accurate representation of what's happening.
Okay, fair enough. Tom Nichols, let's try this. Putin has now admitted that he has sent unmarked Russian soldiers to Crimea leading up to and during the annexation. Why reveal that kind of deception?
Why not? What price has he paid for any of this? In a sense, this is Putin reaffirming the real policy goal here, which is that this is only marginally about Ukraine. And I agree completely with Angela Stent that trying to compare Russian and American actions in Ukraine is specious. But I think the notion that Putin is trying to keep this that much of a secret is mistaken, because it's only partly about Ukraine. What Putin really wants to do is to show that the West is impotent, that the West cannot help the people of the region, including the people in the eastern states of NATO. That's really his goal here, is Putin is trying to push NATO hard to see if it breaks. And so at every turn, as he's discovered, and he's really not trying that hard not to be discovered, he simply steps forward and says, okay, fine, there are Russian troops there. As if to say, and what will anybody do about it, including the United States? That's part of his policy goal, is to simply throw it in the face of the Europeans and almost dare them to react. And so far, he's been betting wisely that they won't react. My big fear is that he's going to keep gambling, he's going to keep taking risks, again, barely veiling his activities. That's one of the reasons I agree with Angela that this really isn't Maskirovka. This is just a game of statecraft for him. And eventually he's going to push too hard and he's going to provoke a crisis that he didn't foresee and can't get out of.
I want to follow up on that word eventually, because here's what Walter Russell Mead wrote in The American Interest a couple of weeks ago, where he says he, Putin, needs triumphs abroad to vindicate and justify his rule and his repression at home, and foreign policy victories are like cocaine when it comes to their impact on public opinion. The buzz of each hit soon wears off, leaving only the craving for another and larger dose. Putin has grown and will grow hungrier and more reckless with each gain notched, each victory achieved. Mikhail Molchanov, I wonder whether you think we are getting to a point where the patriotic high that Putin is enjoying is about to wear off, using that metaphor of the cocaine addict. Is there a point where you think this high wears off?
Well, first of all, I would like to disagree with the citation that somehow the events of the last year can predict and establish with some determination the events, the subsequent events or actions of aggressive nature on the part of the Russian regime. I would disagree with that, but let's not be guessing. We'll just have to wait and see, and I believe that it's not for long that we'll wait and see that indeed all these fears of aggression in the Baltic states or somewhere else are vastly exaggerated. As for the idea that somehow Putin tries to provoke West into action, I actually want to piggyback a little bit, and I think it's an important thing we touched. Tom Nichols touched upon the idea that there are actions based on strength and there are actions based on relative weakness. So what Russia is doing now in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine, is based on weakness, and this explains the use of disguise tactics and everything else. If Russia were indeed engaged in thuggery, then, as Putin said in no uncertain terms, Russian tanks would be in Kiev already, and absolutely nothing would happen, and NATO would not intervene because Ukraine is not part of the Article 6 protection. So Russia is not waging war with Ukraine. If Russia were waging war with Ukraine, there would be no pro-American government in Kiev right now, and Russian tanks would be already on the Polish border.
Tom Nichols, last word to you.
This question of, well, a year from now, we really shouldn't worry about the Baltics or any place else. Remember, it was a year ago that many people in the West were saying, well, Russia would never dare take Crimea. And once they took Crimea, they said, well, Russia won't go into eastern Ukraine. And then they took eastern Ukraine. And then Russia wouldn't dare arm separatists with advanced weapons. And then they armed separatists with advanced weapons. The thing to understand is that Vladimir Putin wants to redraw the map of Europe by force. And every day that goes by that his troops and his forces are on the loose in Eastern Europe doing as they please is a day that Putin is reestablishing that the use of violence in international affairs in Europe is the new normal.
Tom Nichols from the U.S. Naval War College. Angela Stent, Director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown. Mikhail Molchanov, St. Thomas University. Good debate, everybody. Thanks for joining us on TVO tonight.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.